Before we get started, just like to acknowledge the lands I'm calling in from today, the lands of the Wadawurrung people. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which everyone is calling in from today, so please feel free to share that in the chat if you'd like to. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and acknowledge their ongoing connection to skies, lands and waterways throughout Australia. I thought I might acknowledge too that there's so much we can learn from our First Nations culture, and a relevance to today's session. Earlier this year I heard from a First Nations business, Closing the Gap, that the time horizons they use for their business strategies are multi-generational. And this is kind of a valuable insight we can take into when we get into the discussion later about setting these transition plans. So who are we? I think a lot of the attendees today have joined a few, so you should know this part by now. But Anthesis is a world-leading, purpose-driven, digitally enabled, science-based activator. We're a large group of sustainability experts, and we like to collaboratively work with companies to strategically reduce emissions and navigate sustainability frameworks, including the upcoming ASRS ones. For those of you who know us from our former days, we were Endeavour Environmental, a B Corp, and now we've proudly joined a bigger B Corp. So who are you going to hear from today? Myself, Hannah. I lead our ESG and mandatory reporting business line. We've got Amy Quinton, who's a principal consultant who leads up our mandatory reporting service line. And we're very lucky to have one of our valued clients, Meredith Reed, Head of Sustainability at Orica, joining us today to share some insights from her experience. So today I'm going to do a quick deep dive into the climate transition planning process in line with ASRS 2. Just wanted to flag too, we've got another webinar coming up separately that's just for NGAs, or targeting NGAs reporters around the ASRS. That's on the 13th of November. So if any NGAs reporters are on the line, I'll keep an eye out for that one. So let's jump in. I'll hand over to you, Amy, to tell us what is a climate transition plan.
Great, thanks, Hannah. Great to be part of this session. So if we move to the next slide, we'll start with the overview of the climate transition planning, and then it'll be great to hear Meredith's insights at Orica on their experience. So firstly, importantly, what is a climate transition plan? And in this context, what does this mean for mandatory reporting? So the new standards, the AASB S2 for climate-related disclosures in Australia, which is very closely aligned with the IFRS S2 standard, defines a climate transition plan as an aspect of an entity's overall strategy that lays out the entity's targets, actions, and resources for its transitions towards a lower carbon economy. And that includes actions such as reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a bit of a mouthful, and we'll unpack these different elements. You'll notice there's not only one piece, it's not just decarbonisation, but that's an important focus in the definition. And some questions that you might have in reactions to this is either that seems like a lot, or maybe it doesn't capture everything. Common questions are around what about actions to adapt and build resilience to the physical impacts of climate change? Where does nature and just transition fit into this? And there are all important considerations. So we'll unpack those a bit further. I'll just skip across to the next slide, Han.
Has that worked?
One more. Thank you. Oh, okay. Oh, that's all right. Sorry, Han, skip back.
Okay.
Thank you. So how do these mandatory requirements apply to climate transition plans, or alternatively, how do climate transition plans fit into these new mandatory scheme? And just to set the scene for what is in the standard, and then we'll zoom out and have a look at some of the frameworks and also regulatory expectations that are evolving in Australia and globally. So this is about disclosing information about the strategy and decision-making processes for responding to climate risks and opportunity, as well as their progress towards achieving climate-related targets. And we'll talk about how some of the new frameworks really help to expand on this requirement. And importantly, it's about achieving targets. It's also about those anticipated changes to the entity's business model, potential resource allocation in the near and longer term focus. What are the current and anticipated and there's some terminology to unpack here. So the standard uses the terms mitigation and adaptation efforts. So that's really about how are you responding to those climate risks and opportunities? How are you reducing greenhouse gas emissions and supporting that adaptation and resilience to climate change? And that might be within the entity directly, improving infrastructure, and aspects within the business, and it might also be within the broader value chain as well, supporting customers and suppliers and part of that broader impact as well. And then to answer a common question is it actually mandatory to have a climate transition plan? And are there mandatory elements of that? Does it have to be 1.5 degree line and so forth? And at this stage, the standards don't require you to have a transition plan, but there is a requirement that if you do have one, that it's disclosed. Keeping that in mind, the standard does actually draw out a lot of elements of a transition plan, even if you don't have a standalone transition plan. So we've just discussed some of them straight from the standard there, as a big focus on transparency around how progress on targets is tracked as well. And so having a transition plan can actually be a great opportunity to take a strategic approach to building that resilience into your business and achieving compliance as well. The next slide. I'll touch on some of the broader regulatory expectations and the trends that are evolving in Australia and globally, and then we'll get a bit more into the frameworks themselves and how to develop a climate transition plan. We're seeing in Australia and globally this shift from voluntary reporting and those higher level guiding frameworks to a more mandatory and detailed and standardised approach to not only climate reporting, but including transition planning. So I just went into that detail of what the standard covers, those key elements of a transition plan, as well as the need to disclose the transition plan if you have one. There's a broad expectation from stakeholders and regulators that increasingly those plans are credible, comprehensive, and comparable as well. And so that we look at aspects like 1.5 degree aligned, a clear scope around what those targets for a 1.5 degree aligned transition look like for your business, what's in and out, the timing and resourcing, and an increasing focus area is that use of offsets. How are offsets part of your plan? And being really clear on how they'll be used in the short and longer term. There's also an expectation that progress is tracked and disclosed, and so a great way to set that up is to use your annual climate-related disclosures as a way to actually just update and track progress annually. Whereas the transition plan itself may only be say updated every several years, if that's what fits best with your business. And to touch on the Australian landscape and more broadly as well, we have recently seen the government publish its sustainable finance strategy, which has highlighted strengthening corporate transition plans as a top priority. And that starts with these mandatory disclosure requirements. It flags guidance and consultation on that guidance and what that means in the Australian context. For example, linking with the government's broader net zero and sector plans that it's developing and releasing shortly, as well as the sustainable finance taxonomy as well. So how do we bring all these things together? And then more broadly, there's announcements in Europe, for example, that the body there responsible for those standards and requirements in the EU, the CSRD, will publish guidance and be consulting on its guidance for transition planning too. And then we'll move on to discuss some of the frameworks and guidance in the market. But to note that this is not just a trend in Australia and Europe. These standards that are coming into Australia are also being introduced around the world, across Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Canada. New Zealand's already ahead with their standards in place, including requirements for transition planning. And the definition of transition planning there explicitly includes that adaptation and climate resilient focus as well. So it can be a lot to digest here when we look at this map of just a few of the different frameworks out there. I appreciate it can be complex navigating these. What we're trying to show here are that they are all these different frameworks that are evolving, and they do serve different purposes, but they're all drawing on similar concepts. And I really wanted to highlight the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures here, which many on this group will be familiar with, and really recommend to go back to our sort of part 1 introduction if you're looking for more understanding of some of the background to this. But that TCFD framework is that higher level framework, 11 recommendations that's been really instrumental for supporting voluntary reporting in this space. And there's a suite of guidance that has sat underneath that those recommendations, which has supported organisations with their climate, including with climate transition planning. Now, when we're moving to this mandatory setting, all of these standards in Australia and globally, including the Transition Plan Task Force framework for disclosing transition plans, all builds on this core TCFD and aligned with the TCFD. So when you hear talk about TCFD, all these frameworks that we're talking about as well are built on that and are helping to sort of standardise and increase the granularity around those recommendations. Target setting methodologies and validations can be really useful processes to support that technical and verifiable side of things. So they're an important piece of this. And then there's these different assessment tools as well. We've got Climate Action 100 Plus, which is the largest investor in corporate engagement initiative, and they have some great resources, frameworks, and assessment tools, and other tools out there to support climate and assess climate transition planning. An important note here is that we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive on that TPT transition plan framework, and that's looking at understanding that the IFRS itself has actually taken ownership of this TPT framework, which makes it a really key reference for reporting against the AASB S2 standards in Australia, because we'll see how closely it builds on that and aligns with it. So with that in mind, let's jump into one of those frameworks, that the recent TPT, Transition Plan Task Force Disclosure Framework, which was initially built out of the UK, but as I mentioned, has now been adopted into that international suite of resources. So the TPT recommends that entities consider a strategic and rounded approach to their transition planning. And in the interest of time, our main objective here is to highlight how this fits in with the Australian standards, and then hand over to Meredith to also provide some insights on what they're doing there. So the key takeaway here is that it's not just about decarbonisation, it's a really important part, but also responding to climate-related risks and opportunities and contributing to an economy-wide transition. So that in some cases will be looking far beyond your initial operational emissions in some cases, and particularly for financial institutions where they're a step removed to actually look at what is the impact on the ground. And the ISSB, the Vice Chair of the ISSB, as part of IFRS, has really highlighted that this framework is a practical and useful complement to the standards. So moving on, this just gives an overview of that framework in more detail, and with those principles of ambition, action, and accountability, and those 5 foundational disclosure elements. There's a suite of detail underneath that, which we won't get into today, but just to highlight that these really are complementary to the mandatory reporting standards, and really also build on other frameworks that are in place already. We'll move on. Thank you. Just to touch on there's a lot there, and it can be quite daunting to sort of navigate some of these standards. So taking a step back and look at how do we actually get from where we are today to that disclosure. So there's some great guidance out there. These planning stages can be a great reference point, moving from assessing those climate risk and opportunities, setting that strategic ambition, planning actions, and then moving to implementation and disclosure. But I think an important takeaway here is that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach at all. It's an iterative process, and that this is just a framework to follow, but most organizations are doing these different pieces in different stages, and I'm sure Meredith will shed some light on their experience and the timing and the process of how we get there. So with that snapshot, I'll now hand over to Meredith.
Hi everyone, and thank you to Hannah and Amy and the NPSIS team for the opportunity to participate in the webinar today. That was a really great overview and some really good takeaways for companies that are currently considering their disclosures around climate transition planning for ASRS. And I'm really pleased to share some of the insights from Orica's journey to date. So from our perspective, the approach to evaluating climate risk and opportunity and transition planning has a relatively long history, but really started in earnest in its current form around 2017, when we first started considering an approach to quantifying the financial risk of tightening carbon regulations globally on our emissions-intensive manufacturing assets, and understanding a bit more the commercial case to decarbonise, as well as potential pathways for us to do so. And this was driven by a sort of a tangible reason, with the introduction of the safeguard mechanism in its original form here in Australia, which captured 2 of our assets, and emissions regulation also in Alberta and Canada, where we had another facility. So over the subsequent years, we spent time formulating and looking at evidence-based decarbonisation pathways, and also exploring market and regulatory expectations for climate-related disclosures for our sector. And in 2019, we made the commitment to voluntarily adopt the recommendations for the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TCFD, as Amy referred to. So this reporting framework has really been one of the key drivers in uplifting Orica's transition planning processes through formalisation of our disclosures and climate considerations, not just in relation to greenhouse gas emissions performance, but also target setting and progress, improvements to governance, assessment of climate-related risk and opportunity, and embedding climate into our business strategy. From 2020, we progressively implemented a roadmap towards TCFD-aligned reporting, which was designed to identify and address disclosure gaps, and in doing so, start to educate both internal and external stakeholders and inform a strategic approach to climate and decarbonisation. So also in 2020, we introduced an updated climate change policy and released our original suite of climate commitments, which we subsequently strengthened in 2023. And we released our first standalone climate action report in 2021, aligned to that TCFD reporting framework. Through that time, as part of our sort of TCFD aligned approach, we embedded stronger governance over climate, including at the board level, with a board committee renamed from Safety, Health, Environment to Safety and Sustainability, and updating the terms of reference to include climate change responsibilities explicitly. We also embedded sustainability representation into our investment committee so that we could inform financial planning and capital allocation decisions. So in addition to our decarbonisation targets and approach and tracking progress against these commitments, one of the most important aspects of the TCFD framework is the consideration of climate-related risks and opportunities, and how these are managed and integrated into the business. So in particular for Orica, the consideration of risk and scenario planning across much longer time horizons has informed an approach to bringing climate considerations into Orica's risk management framework, and brought forward recognition of key transition risks to the business, particularly in relation to long-term shifts in commodity demand and customer mix. And as Amy mentioned, this is not too far afield from what Orica would have been doing anyway around sort of risk evaluation across the business, but bringing that climate lens in has been really important. In 2023, we also refreshed our scenario analysis as part of a cyclical review and conducted a base case assessment. So the key updates, again, looking through that climate lens, specifically introduced a new emissions overshoot scenario, extended the time horizon out to 2050, and adopted a Paris-aligned IEA net zero by 2050 data set. We also more comprehensively incorporated carbon pricing and physical climate impacts into that analysis. So progressively, we've embedded these climate-related physical and transition risk considerations into our enterprise risk management approach, and we now disclose a reasonably comprehensive summary of risk evaluations and responses annually as part of our reporting. If we could flick maybe to the next slide. So the culmination of this work has really helped inform our strategy, and as a result, sustainability is embedded into our company purpose. Key climate-related performance outcomes are also linked to short-term and long-term incentives at the group level, and these include progress towards achieving our operational emissions reduction targets and a focus also on portfolio resilience and diversification. And pleasingly, we have made really strong progress towards our 2030 operational emissions reduction target, with our Scope 1 and 2 emissions at 22% below our 2019 baseline at the end of our last reporting year. And this has been achieved through progressive implementation of our decarbonisation roadmap, which has focused primarily on deploying abatement technology across our manufacturing assets globally. So in the Orica experience, we found that aligning to the TCFD in terms of our reporting has been really valuable in formalising an approach to climate change and decarbonisation. And in some cases, I would say that, in fact, it's been a case of disclosure driving performance, as it's really helpful to know what you're doing, and you can't really improve what you're not measuring. And it really is a great way to build that awareness of gaps, both within the business and also across key stakeholder groups externally. We have also been guided broadly by other frameworks and other measures, as Amy also indicated. There's a whole raft of opportunities to look at different frameworks and different ways of disclosing performance in this space. So relevant to Orica has also been investor feedback and particularly investor-led coalitions such as Climate Action 100, who include Orica in their annual net zero company benchmark assessment. We've also historically leveraged the CDP framework for disclosures as well. So the criteria within these different frameworks we find can be very informative in understanding interests of particular stakeholder groups, which can then be used internally to guide areas of focus and performance uplift. But having said that, one of the key learnings from us as a business and a key takeaway I would say is that it's really important within these frameworks to also be guided by materiality for your individual business and ensure alignment with core business strategy to make sure that what you're doing and disclosing actually makes sense and is the right thing for your company. Generally speaking, I would say that our experience with these frameworks has been really helpful, and inherently they do drive disclosures that make sense to the business, and also through those disclosures help your external stakeholders understand what is material and important to your company and why you're doing what you're doing, which can be really valuable. Just to round out in terms of preparedness for the ASRS reporting requirements, the TCFD aligned approach that we've had to date has set us up reasonably well. Nonetheless, we have conducted now a gap assessment to identify gaps in our current disclosures as well as true gaps where we actually need to uplift our performance. And we've got a cross-functional working group established internally to implement a roadmap to address these gaps ready for implementation from next year. Part of that roadmap is a focus on data integrity and quality. And our approach there is building on current processes around internal verification and external assurance to ensure data confidence and accuracy. We've spent time internally also educating various parts of the business around sustainability reporting obligations, and this has ensured the company has matured organically in this respect there's a really good level of recognition across the business of the importance of this. So thank you very much for your time, and thanks to ASRS for having me. I think that's me done. I'm happy to open to questions.
Thanks, Meredith. Thanks, Amy. If anyone does have questions, please put them in the chat. I've got a couple of key takeaways to share, but I might jump in with a question first, Meredith, while you're still on your role, because you have been doing this for so many years, building up Oricas. Would there be any kind of key tips that you have for those online with like any what was like the kind of biggest challenge or pain point that you had to overcome, and how did you do that you could enlighten our audience with?
Sure, thank you. So I think for us, it's really about getting buy-in across the different parts of the business. So not so much, a single pain point, but just the importance of everyone sort of recognizing and understanding what you're trying to achieve and why. And to achieve that, I guess at Orica, it was really a process of sort of educating over a number of years, and bringing that level of awareness up across the business, and particularly making it quite tangible to the leadership team, drawing on things that are relevant and material, and leveraging kind of what we already do as a business and bringing a climate lens into that, I think is probably one of the key points that we used. And still a work in progress. There's still, a range of perspectives across leadership, but I think we have made really good progress, and there is a broad understanding that this is important to the business, and you can see that from sort of external pressures as well, and questions that you get from shareholders and things. So making it meaningful, making it aligned to what the business is trying to achieve anyway, I think is probably the best way to manage that.
Thank you. So anyone in the audience, please feel free to put some in. So Amy and Meredith summarised a few of the key takeaways from what's been shared so far, and it's really sounding like this preparing a climate transition plan, while Amy mentioned, is not necessarily mandatory for this. It's a really valuable way to kind of tie in all the requirements that are mandatory into a really strategic, cohesive path forward for your business, like Meredith was sharing, that can really help enhance your position, and pull everything together and have a path forward. It's an iterative process. It can be complex. There's frameworks out there to use. Don't be afraid to ask for help and start somewhere. It's not a tick box exercise. This is this is your business strategy. This is our future that you're kind of wanting to be working towards. So just get started. Actually, I had another. I'm going to jump in with another question too. This one might be more you, Amy, because we've talked about this, the TPT framework being the one that ISSB is adopting. Is it locked in that the Australian government's going to produce its own leveraging that, or is that still uncertain at the moment?
It's very likely that the Australian guidance will pull directly from that TPT framework. The TPT framework is referenced in the Sustainable Finance Strategy. So yes, that will be the basis, I think, the building blocks of Australia, and then it's about putting it in our local context.
No other questions have popped up. I'll just do a plug for our next lot of webinars that are coming up. So our next one is around materiality. So Meredith had also mentioned just before, focusing on the material items for your transition plan, and looking at materiality as a key requirement under the standards. And then our one after that will be on effective reporting. And as I mentioned earlier, we've got the special NGERS one coming up. What's that, next week? Couple of weeks. If there are no other questions or any other final words from our speakers, we can give everybody a minute back in their day to get started on their climate transition plans. But please feel free to, if you do have any questions that pop up later, as always, send them through and we'll try and answer them for you. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you for your time. And big thank you, Meredith, for joining us, and Amy, as always.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much.